Hello, everyone. This is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. In the Theaetetus, one of his later dialogues, Plato deals with the question of how we are to define knowledge. The discussion will focus on knowledge of the world of our sense experience and not knowledge of concepts. The big question that governs the dialogue is how to distinguish knowledge from mere belief. Under what conditions can I say, I don't just think it, I know it? The position to be debated will be a form of the theory of Protagoras, who is known for his statement that man is the measure of all things. Another important topic on which I will focus is the question of when knowledge is relative, such that what may be true for you might not be true for me. The dialogue is famous for its introduction and rejection of the idea that knowledge is justified true belief, which is actually a short section at the end. Usually in my videos, I leave a critical section to the end, but this time I will have it run alongside, combined with explanations. In the dialogue, Socrates seeks to have a discussion with his friend Theodorus. However, Theodorus has with him a young friend Theaetetus, who impresses him as capable of sparring with Socrates, and so defers to him. After some casual introductory dialogue, Theaetetus gives his first definition of knowledge when he says, "It seems to me that one who knows something is perceiving the thing he knows. And, so far as I can see at present, knowledge is nothing but perception." Socrates remarks that this theory is a different way of stating the doctrine of Protagoras, whom he quotes as stating, "Man is the measure of all things, alike of the being of things that are, and of the not being of things that are not." Now, in terms of clarifications, when the same wind is blowing, it may seem chilly to one person but not to another. It is a cold wind to some, but not to others. And so it is as it appears to each of us. Inasmuch as something appearing and it being perceived mean the same thing, an object will be to each man as he perceives it. Perception will then become something that is infallible and a perception of something real. And Theaetetus agrees to this. This theory will be expanded upon in the discussion. The doctrine effectively declares that nothing is just one thing by itself. This is a consequence of the idea that an object seeming hot to one person and cold to another will not be hot or cold in itself. An object other than the wind may seem heavy or light, small or large. This will mean that all things are really in a process of becoming, as a result of movement and change. And thus Socrates here is adding to the proposed definition of knowledge a theory particularly associated with Heraclitus, who believed that everything is in constant change and is famous for the statement that you can never step into the same river twice. The doctrine holds further that so-called being and becoming are produced by motion, while non-being and perishing are produced by rest. Fire, which is the agent of change, is itself generated by movement and friction. Both the body and the soul are preserved by their versions of motion and exercise. Given this blending of opposites, the hot and the cold, heavy and light, black and white, the implication will be that no single thing is a possessor of these qualities in and by itself. The black or white of any entity we choose must not be something in the object, but is instead something that results from the interaction of motion and our sense organs. And so Socrates says that what we say is this or that color will be neither the I which encounters the motion, nor the motion which is encountered, but something which has arisen between the two and is peculiar to each several percipient. Some interesting puzzles may seem to arise from this theory, as illustrated by relative comparisons. If we consider 6 dice, they are more than 4 dice by a factor of 1.5, yet they are only half as many as 12 dice. Also, if Socrates is taller than Theaetetus before Theaetetus stops growing, Theaetetus may outgrow him, and then Socrates will be shorter. The theory under consideration explains this in terms of the outcome of motion and change. The result is that this complex of motions between perceiver and perceived allows Socrates to conclude and add to the proposed theory the conclusion from all this, as we said at the outset, that nothing is one thing just by itself, but is always in the process of becoming for someone, and being is to be ruled out altogether. Now the proposal that knowledge is perception has gained a theory of perception that may well go beyond what Protagoras intended. The theory is being developed with the assent of Theaetetus. It goes along with Socrates explaining his metaphor of him practicing his mother's art of midwifery and seeking to give birth to a well-developed theory to see if it is lively or stillborn. Theaetetus finds this combination of the theories of Protagoras and Heraclitus acceptable. At this point, Socrates still considers the theory incomplete, because it cannot yet account for dreams and madness. Are these false perceptions that disprove the theory? Or can knowledge as perception still be saved? Socrates thinks it can be saved, at least from this. In dreaming, as well as when awake, our minds contend that what is seen is real. We can also doubt at any time that we are awake rather than dreaming. It turns out that the same holds true for disease and madness. The madman appears to himself to be sane, just as when dreaming. We end up taking the dream world to be the real one, at least until waking up. Given that our theory under consideration says that what appears to each man is for him to whom it appears, it can still be valid in some sense, even though we say that the madmen and the dreamers may be believing something that is false. A proposition about the appearance will still be true. To give an example of whatever's seeming to a person being true for him, Socrates compares the different conditions of Socrates healthy and Socrates ill. Taken as a whole, the two are not exactly the same, because everything is becoming, including Socrates, making the two different things. When Socrates healthy drinks wine, he finds it sweet. In an ill state, the interactions produce a different offspring, which is a taste of sourness. The same person in a different condition is acted upon differently, as if he is a different person. The thing perceived in interaction with him creates another quality. And he concludes that I shall not come to have this sensation for myself, nor will the object come to be of such a quality for itself. Someone who perceives must be perceiving something, and the object may become sour or sweet to someone. Subject and object become what they are for each other. This renders it true that my perception is true for me, even though it may not be true for others. I cannot be mistaken about my perception. And so the theory under consideration has 3 parts. There is a theory of Heraclitus that all things move like flowing streams, the doctrine of Protagoras that man is the measure of all things, and the conclusion of Theaetetus that perception is knowledge. The justification so far for the theory is that perception is infallible and has something real as its object, which really is as it appears to each person. The theory will be critically examined first regarding what is borrowed from Protagoras, secondly regarding what is borrowed from Heraclitus, and finally regarding the definition of knowledge as perception from Theaetetus. The set of preliminary objections to the theory starts with asking why man? Why not pig the measure of all things, since they are also capable of perception? Even among men, if what every man believes as a result of perception is true for him, then all men are to have their own true beliefs. In that case, wherein lies the wisdom of Protagoras, who sets himself up to teach others and charges a fee for it? So we have two objections here. The first is that man will have no special place if knowledge is identified with perception. The second is more important. Socrates does not make it explicit here, but he has moved from talking about the contents of perception, which he has admitted to be infallible, to judgments of what is or what is not, based on our perceptions. If our judgments of what is or what is not, based on perception, are also true as it seems to each separate observer, then no one man can be wiser than another. So we will have to bring into question the idea that man can be the measure of all things regarding judgments based on experience. It may seem easier to dispute that knowledge is perception by pointing to a kind of knowledge that is not in perception. If we know something that is in memory but not currently being perceived, then perception cannot be equated with knowledge. Otherwise, given the equation, we would then have a contradiction in that I can know something and at the same time not know that I know it. We would need to add something to the original perception to know that we know. But the theory may still be expanded to include memories of perceptions, and therefore objects of knowledge in memory. It really then becomes an argument about meaning. In ordinary language, I know can mean things other than I perceive, or to have perceived and now remember. So this theory would at least need revision if we do not reject it as patently false. These objections only apply to the theory of knowledge as perception, as stated by Theaetetus. Protagoras is dead at this time, so Socrates undertakes to bring forward the counter-arguments that Protagoras would have put forward. He would say that only Theaetetus has been refuted. The present memory of a past impression is not a thing of the same character as the original experience. Given this, I can know something in memory while not currently seeing it, and the contradiction of knowing and not knowing that I know the same thing does not arise. A second way that the accusation of a contradiction can be refuted is in regard to the way the argument was set up by Socrates. When comparing Socrates healthy and Socrates ill, we are using different measures of the same thing, if Socrates is always becoming. So it is not the same person who supposedly knows and does not know the same thing. Furthermore, if we grant that each man has his own peculiar perceptions, it does not follow that what appears to each becomes and is for him alone to whom it appears. What Protagoras has written is that each one of us is a measure of what is and what is not, but at the same time, there is a difference between one man and another in the fact that what is and appears to one is different from what is or appears to another. Now, as for this counter-argument from peculiarity of perception, we already have Socrates healthy and Socrates ill as an example. We do not have an example of peculiar perceptions of two different men. But if we imagine that Theaetetus and Socrates look at Theodorus, they see him from different angles and recognize him on the basis of their own memories of him. And from this, they may draw the same conclusion. Yet, even if we agree also not to include the question of why not pig the measure of all things, there still remains the question of how one man can be wiser than another under this theory of Protagoras. So Socrates has Protagoras replying to the effect that, "And as for wisdom and the wise man, I am very far from saying they do not exist. By a wise man, I mean precisely a man who can change any one of us. When what is bad appears and is to him, and make what is good appear and be to him." The healthy man is not wiser than the sick man just because he thinks differently, but because he is in a better state. Education puts people in a better state, which is the good of the sophist through discourse. It does not change a man who thinks something false into a man who thinks something true. It takes someone in a depraved condition of mind and uses reason to make him think other thoughts of a sound condition that people ignorantly call true. Alternatively, Protagoras believes that one set of thoughts can be better than another rather than true. A wise man cares for the condition of others as the physician cares for the body, and a husbandman cares for plants. Wise public speakers substitute sound for unsound views of what is right. As for the state, whatever policies that seem right to it are right, so long as it holds to these practices. If the practices are unsound, the wise man substitutes others that are and appear sound. On these principles, the sophist is wise and is worth his fees. In this sense, we can believe both that some men are wiser than others and also that no one thinks falsely. As for who in the 20th century might be following in the footsteps of the sophists, some of what we have been discussing sounds like the pragmatism of William James. He does also speak of one belief being in some sense better than its negation and the one that should obtain our assent. But that is the end of the similarities. The pragmatism of James says that there is an objective truth. He defines truth differently because he believes that adopting the true belief will make a positive difference in our dealings with an objective reality. Contemporary Frankfurt School neo-Marxists and postmodernists would deny reintroducing the sophist tradition because they claim to be champions of the so-called oppressed against the system. Yet the goal of neo-Marxism is a political outcome, and what they call critical thinking adapts belief about everything else to it, resulting in a contrived rather than a derived worldview. Postmodernism is undeniably relativistic, with its claim of there being no stable and objective truth. The similarities are there. The real question, potentially, is whether Plato's refutations of the sophists of his time apply also to the people who exhibit those similarities in our time. Protagoras represents a broad relativism regarding the possibility of different truths about facts as well as values and political opinions. To him, it would be just to have a state in Arabia allowing men to marry multiple women, while it would also be just for Athens to forbid the same behavior. It is possible to be relativistic about only one thing or some things, creating an individual, cultural, or temporal relativism, possibly only in relation to morals or facts, or both. The sophists make themselves an arch-enemy of Plato. For them, there is no one truth, and as a result, we try to believe the better idea. Plato takes the contrary opinion, that there is an objective truth that can be known and so we can believe the true. As such, for him, political goals and preferences are not standards of what to believe, and must be rationally justifiable in terms of a higher order knowledge of justice. Going back to the dialogue, Socrates proceeds to criticize the Protagorean theory of man as measure of all things. He had earlier criticized Protagoras for making every man effectively equal in his wisdom, but then backpedaled in his realization that Protagoras had his reasons for believing that some men can be wiser than others. Yet Protagoras does say that what seems true to anyone is true for him to whom it seems so. Do people agree with Protagoras? And what are the implications if we do not? Every man regards himself wiser than others in some manner, and regards others to be wiser than him in some other respects. In times of danger, men respect as a god any man who can take control of the situation. In short, we do agree that wisdom and ignorance exists among us. We also believe that wisdom lies in thinking truly, and that ignorance is false belief. Given this, the Protagorean doctrine creates a disastrous consequence. Here is Socrates' first proof against Protagoras. Either what we think is always true, or what we think is sometimes true. If what we think is sometimes true, it contradicts the theory of Protagoras. If what we think is always true, then ironically, what we think cannot always be true, because one of the things we think is that ignorance, conceived as false belief, exists among us. In other words, how could we always be right if one of our beliefs is that we are sometimes wrong? So either Protagoras is wrong, or his being correct creates a contradiction. The third possibility, that what we think is never true, would also contradict Protagoras. This is a kind of constructive dilemma argument under which either one of two possibilities both imply that Protagoras must be wrong. This is not the only negative consequence of the theory of Protagoras. Next comes what might be called the argument from self-referentiality, that the theory of Protagoras is self-nullifying. That is to say that if the theory is taken as consistently true and applied to itself, the implication is that it is false. Socrates makes the argument by saying that if Theodorus, to whom he is speaking at this point, forms a judgment and expresses it, others may form a judgment about his judgment and disagree. So is the judgment of Theodorus true for him and false for the others, as the theory of Protagoras seems to imply? Socrates asks, what then is the consequence for Protagoras himself? Supposing that Protagoras truly believed that man is the measure of all things, and the mass of mankind judges otherwise, does this not mean that this theory is only true for Protagoras himself and false for the others? Potentially, we could say that it is more false than true if the unbelievers outnumber the believers. And so Socrates concludes, it involves a really exquisite conclusion. Protagoras, for his part, admitting as he does that everybody's opinion is true, must acknowledge the truth of his opponent's belief about his own belief, where they think he is wrong. That is to say, he would acknowledge his own belief to be false if he admits that the belief of those who think him wrong is true. What this ultimately means is that if it seems to me that there is an absolute truth that is true for all, then that is true for all, including Protagoras, as an application of his own theory. Socrates does not add this, but I would argue that even one person disagreeing with Protagoras about this in particular would invalidate this particular theory. If I am right that there is such a thing as an absolute truth, no matter what seems to anyone, then the theory of Protagoras is also false for him. Socrates here is arguing instead from the implications of a greater number of people disagreeing with Protagoras. We could argue about whether this constitutes an argumentum ad populum fallacy or appeal to the bandwagon, but it does allow Socrates to argue on a relative scale that the theory of Protagoras would be more false than true, which is his argument. Either way, Protagoras is lacking in self-referentiality, in that he does not see the implications of what happens if an opponent turns his own table on him. To give Plato all due credit, he is formulating these arguments prior to advances in logic that entitle him to more simply say that if this theory is true, then it is false, and therefore it is false. Postmodernists today have also been accused by critics of this lack of self-referentiality for this reason. I will provide a link below to a good video by someone else who makes this clear. They assume that there is something special about them, that their own ideas are not, in their language, culturally relative meta-narrative and coercive discourse, subject to being deconstructed. But can some form of relativism still be staved and still be true? Well, yes. Even if the truth of a particular proposition is absolute, belief in it may still be, and often enough is, culturally relative, or part of some kind of zeitgeist. However, even if it were true that there is no truth, we would not therefore owe any obedience or belief to anyone who claims to have discovered it. The question still remains of whether the sophist can maintain that he is wiser than others. A physician is wiser about how to obtain good health, and the analogy claimed is that the sophist is likewise wiser about what to believe for both individuals and the state. Yet, at the same time, Protagoras believes that whatever a state deems advantageous for itself is so, whatever advantageous might mean. This advantage is the aim of the legislation and the laws. This gives Socrates a way to bring into question this analogy of the wisdom of ideas with the wisdom of health of the physician. When it comes to predicting the future, we trust the vine grower's judgment on whether the wine will be sweet or dry, as we trust the musician to tell us whether the music will be in tune. Protagoras effectively claims expertise in judging the future, at least in what arguments will succeed in the courts and the effects of legislation. More importantly, he effectively claims the state to be the proper judge of its practices as long as they are in place. Yet the state is often mistaken, even within the pursuit of its own advantage. One of the implications of this is that one man is wiser than another, and the wiser man effectively becomes the measure of things. This exposes a contradiction in Protagoras' theory. He claims both, that what is true for every man is what seems true to him, and that the state, or sometimes he, is better at measuring what is good for the state or an individual. This completes the refutation of Protagoras regarding judgments. There are some who, like translator Francis Cornford, suggest that the argument against Protagoras being wiser is an ad hominem fallacy. This fallacy occurs when an irrelevant statement about the man is put forth as a refutation of the idea that he proposes. In this case, the idea is about the man, and so the statement about him is relevant and not an ad hominem. Protagoras effectively claims himself fit to govern without giving what Plato would call a valid account of what is so special about him that we or the state should accept his advice. This can and should be questioned. It makes sense even to question the motives of relativists. Plato does show a suspicion that Protagoras himself might have a secret doctrine taught only to his pupils. In his essay, The Will to Believe, William James remarks that, quote, "If your heart does not want a world of moral reality, your head will assuredly never make you believe in one." Unquote. I see no reason why the same would not apply to the idea of objective truth. The reason why truth is important is because organizing society according to what is false would create a war against nature that we will lose, and I question anyone's right to impose the negative consequences on others. Today, our culture in the West is under the control of nihilists who want neither truth nor good. Instead, they want censorship and crazy witch hunts against anyone pointing out the falsity of their claims or their ideas producing only disaster. Their variation on Protagoras is that some beliefs are good and others evil, with them being the unaccountable high priests of which is which. There is still the item left over from Heraclitus, that everything is in constant change. What exactly does it mean to say that everything is in change? For clarification, Socrates draws a distinction between two kinds of change. First, there is the phenomenon of an object changing its place, which we call motion. The second is a kind of alteration, where something that may be at rest may grow old or turn black. If it is true that everything is constantly changing, all things must be in both types of change. Now, Socrates brings us back to what was said earlier about hotness and whiteness not being in the hot or white object. These were admitted to be things that move in place along with the perceiver and the thing perceived. Something like the chilliness of the wind can then become an agent with the perceiver as patient. Here Socrates wants to say that the perceiving person comes to have a quality rather than to be it. He sees it as a part of what it means to say that nothing has any being as one thing just by itself. It is because these things are produced by the intercourse between the object and the person. So the wind acquires a chilliness for he to whom it seems chilly. After this, Socrates starts another argument from what the implications of the theory would be, if it were true. If a flowing thing does not flow white, but is instead constantly changing, then we can never give it a proper name, for any accurate description of it is eluding our grasp. Then what are we to say about acts of perception such as seeing and hearing? Seeing would have no more right to be called seeing than non-seeing. And so, if knowledge is the same as perception, and perception has no more right to be called perception than non-perception, then knowledge has no more right to be called knowledge than non-knowledge. Therefore, knowledge cannot be perception unless we abandon this idea of everything in flux. What Socrates has actually refuted here is the idea that change is so constant and omnipresent that we cannot ever have a language that fixes meaning to things through names. What Plato needs here is to dispose of this extreme version of Heraclitean flux, because his theory of forms requires that there be names and concepts with fixed meanings, so that then the forms or ideas are eternal and unchanging. Socrates starts his refutation of knowledge as perception through a clarification of language. We generally speak of seeing or hearing with our eyes and ears, but it is more precise to say that we see and hear through them. We have 5 senses, and what gets united from them meets in a mind. The sense organs should be thought of as instruments of perception, through which we perceive what is cold, hard, light, or sweet. These sensations perceived through one faculty are not perceived through others. For instance, what is an object of hearing, a sound, is not also an object of sight. So if we have a thought of more than one of these objects, a sound and a color, through what organ do we have a thought of both at once? What is common to both is not apprehended through sight or hearing. If we go further into our apprehensions of existence and non-existence, sameness and difference, unity and number, we cannot name a body part through which we perceive these things. Therefore, the mind contemplates some things through its own instrumentality and apprehends other things through sense organs. In an earlier section of the dialogue, perception and the object perceived were treated as a bundle of sensations. In seeking to finally evaluate the theory, Socrates will transition to the unity of the entity that may be hard, hot, and black all at the same time. Regarding the sensations individually within the bundle, such as the chilliness of the wind, it made sense to say that perception is knowledge because it is an infallible perception with something real as its object. But we could also unify the sensations into an object and make judgments on that basis. It does not follow that this unity, or judgments based on this unity, will also be infallible and have the real as its object. Socrates proceeds to bring Theaetetus through a list of what comes from the senses and what we need the mind to contemplate. It is agreed about existence, likeness, sameness, what is honorable or dishonorable, come from reflections of the mind. The hardness of something hard is perceived through touch, but its existence and the potential for softness as a contrary, Socrates says, are things which the mind itself undertakes to judge for us, when it reflects upon them and compares one with another. So Socrates tells us that we are naturally constituted at birth to receive impressions through the sense organs, but reflection about them can only come with difficulty through a process of education. The argument then gets put to Theaetetus to agree that without an understanding of existence, which goes beyond sense impressions, we cannot reach truth. If we cannot reach the truth about a thing, then we cannot have knowledge of it. The conclusion that Socrates could state at this point is that, therefore, without an understanding of the existence of a thing, we cannot know that thing. The conclusion, as he puts it, which implies the same thing, is that if that is so, knowledge does not reside in the impressions, but in our reflection upon them. What Plato is going for here is an idea that our knowledge of the world must have two sources: our sense impressions and also concepts that themselves are not given in sense experience. We want to go beyond simply describing our sense impressions and just saying that I see a sensation of red that has this particular shape, and then make the judgment that I see, smell, and feel an apple, that it is something I might find tasty to eat if it is ripe, like other apples I have eaten in the past. In order to draw those conclusions, I bring in concepts of the existence of the object and likeness with other objects. Likeness and existence are not themselves entities that we can perceive. For those of you who may be familiar with Immanuel Kant, he also speaks of two sources of knowledge from intuition and pure concepts. But Plato is not here constructing a theory where concepts would affect perception itself, rather than just our judgments about what is perceived. Plato is only saying that we need to bring in our concepts in formulating opinions about the perceived object. Given this, perception and knowledge cannot be names for the same thing, because there is knowledge that does not come from perception. Therefore, knowledge cannot be defined as perception. Theaetetus agrees that what he calls perception cannot apprehend truth in existence, and therefore is not available as a definition of knowledge. The earlier observations that infallible statements can be made about an appearance do not extend to judgments about things based on those appearances. The remainder of the dialogue proceeds from the suggestion that if knowledge is not perception, then perhaps it is to be defined in terms of judgment instead. Theaetetus recognizes that there can be such a thing as a false judgment or false belief, and therefore proposes that knowledge is true belief. The obvious objection to this is that it often happens that a man may stumble upon a true belief as a result of a guess that just happens to be right. He seems no wiser than someone else who guesses the contrary, so it makes sense to say that this is not knowledge. As the dialogue proceeds, a search for the nature of false belief produces no result, because when a man has a false judgment, he still believes it to be true until and unless he sees the error. So to find out when we have knowledge, if it is true belief, we must look to the nature of knowledge. Whether we call it knowledge or true belief, how do we know when we have it? The way that Socrates dispenses with the suggestion that knowledge is true belief is to question whether we know something we are taught or persuaded to believe. Most teaching involves persuasion that is not really different from what is done by lawyers before a jury. It is aimed at producing conviction rather than instruction, and teachers are often not as clever at it. Convincing people means making them believe something. And Socrates goes on to argue that when a jury is rightly convinced of facts which can be known only by an eyewitness, then, judging by hearsay and accepting a true belief, they are judging without knowledge, although, if they find the right verdict, their conviction is correct. But if true belief and knowledge were the same thing, the best of jurymen could never have a correct belief without knowledge. It now appears that they must be different things. In other words, we can have correct beliefs without knowing our beliefs are correct. Therefore, true belief and knowledge cannot be the same thing. With this disposal of knowledge as true belief, Plato also shows more clearly an unstated assumption that runs throughout the dialogue. We have an internal belief and an external truth, with the search for some relation between the two that we will call knowledge. The assumption is that this relation is within the mind, like the belief, rather than external to the mind, like the truth. It is an internalism that is the Western philosophical tradition at its root. This kind of scientific linear thinking to get at a truth that we assume to be comprehensible about nature is typical of this tradition. The pre-Socratics, right from the beginning in their curiosity about nature and its regularities, were making individual minds the judges of what may be true or false about nature. The alternative would have been to conceive knowledge as belief that comes from a reliable source, such as perception, testimony, an oracle, or what you were taught to believe. The objection to internalism as an unstated premise without justification might seem reasonable, but I still end up thinking I should step in for Plato and defend it. If knowledge is what comes from a reliable source, how do we determine what is a reliable source? Is that not an internal judgment? And if truth were what an oracle says, or the testimony of someone who is socially allowed to set himself up as a fact-checker, I suspect that any attempt to justify automatic belief could only produce the circular argument that we know he is telling us the truth because he says so. where perception does not make something obvious. If we end up making judgments about what we perceive, externalism would end up in practice being the doctrine that truth is what the emperor says it is. The third and last alternative considered of what knowledge might be only takes up 10 of the 68 pages of the dialogue. Theaetetus and Socrates had both heard of a theory that states that knowledge is not just a true belief, but a true belief accompanied by logos. Now, logos can have many meanings, including discourse, science, or reason in general, but here the discussion makes clear that the logos is an account of or justification for a belief. This is often today called the JTB theory of knowledge. That knowledge is justified, true belief. The discussion about this logos, however, only covers beliefs about the world of objects and does not include demonstration of mathematical objects, concepts, or the good. Plato's Meno dialogue deals with the issue of knowledge associated with demonstration. Socrates now looks for the meaning of this account. After going through various possible meanings, he comes to the important idea that ends the dialogue. The last possibility is that the account of a thing is a distinguishing mark that explains its differentness from other things. So knowledge would then be a correct belief combined with a knowledge of its differentness. And so Socrates concludes, so apparently to the question, what is knowledge? Our definition will reply, correct belief together with knowledge of a differentness. For according to it, adding an account will come to that. And when we are inquiring after the nature of knowledge, nothing could be sillier than to say that it is correct belief together with a knowledge of differentness or of anything whatever. So, Theaetetus, neither perception nor true belief, nor the addition of an account to true belief can be knowledge. As for myself, my tendency is to think that the problem here exposed is that throughout the dialogue, any time we look at a proposal of what knowledge is, the discussion turns on how the believer knows that he is not mistaken. The question really was about when I can assert that I know instead of just believing what I believe. To any answer, it seems someone could question my claims to awareness of its truth, effectively asking, how do I know that I know? It may be worse than trying to come up with a definition of definition and insisting that it never be circular. However, this is still only about our knowledge of objects of sense perception, where mathematical and logical demonstrations are not on offer. Our knowledge of the world of sense experience is never certain, and it should not be a surprise if we cannot define knowledge of this kind when we insist that there be a definite and indisputable answer to how I know that I know something. As to higher orders of knowledge as drawn out in the allegory of the line in the Republic, mathematical objects, concepts, and the good, Plato argues, especially in the Meno, that knowledge is recollection of the forms to which we were exposed prior to birth. The recollection is aided by demonstration and the method of dialectic, which for him means the question and answer method of the dialogue. Well, that's all for now. If you enjoyed it, check out my other videos, send links to your friends, and thanks for watching.